Good evening, everyone. Welcome, members, officers and Cabinet members to this Overview and Scrutiny Panel meeting this evening. Fire alarm procedures are, if the fire alarm is activated, please vacate the offices down the main staircase opposite the lifts in the foyer. Assemble in Hawley Square on the green. Officers will assist you to advise when it is deemed safe to return to the chamber. Would everyone present please ensure their mobile phones are turned to silent and they are not used to make or receive phone calls whilst the meeting is in progress. Please note this meeting is being live streamed for members of the public. This meeting will also be recorded and subsequently broadcast on the internet. Does anyone else intend to film the meeting? And that's a no, and we have no members of the public, so we'll move on. I've not received any requests to speak under 20.1 and no public speaking. So apologies for absence. I've got Councillor Packman, Councillor Moore, substituted by Councillor Vazeki, Councillor Faruqi, substituted by Councillor Joanne Bright, and Councillor Cupp, substituted by Councillor Wright. Is there any more apologies? No? Okay, move on. Any declarations of interest? That's a no. Okay, moving on to the minutes of the previous meeting. We are to approve the minutes of the previous Overview and Scrutiny Panel meeting on the 20th of July 2023. A copy is attached to the agenda pack. Can I have a proposer, please? Councillor Austin and a seconder. Councillor Davis. And do all members agree? Agree, thank you.
Chair, could I just ask something?
Yes.
I know when the leader was first became leader, we talked about the possibility of making our minutes a bit more informative in terms of where we've got one member said this or that sort of thing. Is that something that you're seriously considering going forward with at some point?
I think, Councillor Austin, that's something to talk about in another place. I'm absolutely happy to hear what you've got to say on that, but I think we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it informally outside of meetings. We can talk about it potentially at the Constitution Review Working Panel. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important to understand they're not a script of the meeting. It's just a general overview of the tone of the meeting. Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on to the main agenda item this evening, item number 4, the Cabinet Member presentation by the Leader, and it's an update on the Planning Enforcement Review. I call on the Leader to make his presentation.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I wasn't quite expecting to be back quite as quickly since my last appearance at Scrutiny, but there we go. So, planning enforcement, update on planning enforcement. We've got a few slides for you. As you can see, the planning enforcement team currently consists of a planning enforcement officer and a planning enforcement assistant, both of whom report to the planning applications manager. The way the council operates is on a complaints-based system, prioritising the breaches that cause significant irreparable damage to listed buildings, harm to specially protected areas, including conservation areas, other visually prominent development and protected trees, breaches to Section 106 agreements, and significant and unacceptable harm to living conditions. And the Council investigates allegations of these planning breaches by, first of all, establishing if a breach has occurred. Secondly, seeking to resolve the matter without formal action where possible, securing an application for the work or alteration to comply with planning law and policy, and deciding whether or not to take action following the conclusion of the investigation. But if we're going to do so, it must be in the public interest on sound planning grounds if it's expedient to do so. So there we have some statistics. As you can see, there's a vast difference between the number of complaints to receive and the number of enforcement service notices that are served. That could represent the fact that some of the complaints are not valid, and it's likely that some of the complaints won't be valid. It also would obviously be accounted for by the fact that a lot of issues are resolved informally without needing to issue an enforcement notice. And there will be others which we just will deem that it's not in the public interest to pursue because we don't have the resources to do it. We can debate what they might be and whether they should be pursued, but obviously we can only work within the resources that we've got. So you can see that the number of enforcement notices that have been issued in the last 3 years, 12, 13 and 16, and there's a fairly consistent number of complaints. I'm not sure, not sure whether Mr. Poulter knows whether those complaints are about individual breaches or whether, for example, there might be 100 complaints about a particular breach. But it gives you a good idea of the numbers that are coming in.
My understanding is they're individual complaints rather than multiple complaints about the same breach.
Great, okay. So if we move on to prosecutions, and as you can see, these are detailed reports on individual prosecutions. I'm afraid that I'm not an expert on the individual circumstances of the cases, but they do give you some examples of things that the council has pursued and the actions that have come out of them. So there's some significant fines. 123 Canterbury Road, the original 40,000 summary conviction fine. And another one up the top there, Margate Road, 8,056 plus a victim surcharge. So previously, the previous scrutiny committee had an enforcement review, which I understand wasn't completed. I think members did resolve that the following issues should be considered. Determine the potential utility of a planning enforcement portal on the council's website to provide updates to members of the public and elected members on current cases, as well as increasing the availability of information about the enforcement process for the public. Secondly, identify how the council could come up with a more effective system of prioritising planning enforcement cases. Thirdly, determine how best to improve communication between the council and complainants regarding planning enforcement cases being handled by the council. And finally, determine how best the council could include proactive work in the planning enforcement protocol. And so the review was paused in June 2022, as reported to the panel, due to the publishing of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which will itself have significant implications on planning enforcement, including removing the 4-year rule, after which time operational development and change of use to dwelling houses in breach of planning control is immune from enforcement action. So that means that in future all enforcement breaches will be subject to a 10-year rule. Creation of enforcement warning notices, which are to be served on breaches of planning control, requiring an application to be submitted when there's a reasonable prospect of permission being granted. And also the requirement on applicants to submit commencement notices in relation to approved development upon the start of on-site work with a register kept by the local authority, while a completion notice would be able to be served on developments not meeting the identified targets in the commencement notice. So there's an extra bit of work there for the team. Things have moved on internally since that panel last met. So the council's introduced a section 106 monitoring fee in April 2023, and this was specifically to fund the recruitment of a new Section 106 monitoring and infrastructure delivery officer. The officer started in July 2023, and that's created additional enforcement capacity in requesting, securing planning applications. So that's enabling us to keep track on what we're expecting to happen and trying to make sure that it does happen. The council has procured a new planning database system, iDocs Cloud, which includes increased functionality for planning enforcement with the ability to publish case information via the council's website, and that's expected to go live next year. A new monthly development compliance meeting, which is led by a principal planning officer, coordinating action on new housing development between planning assistants for conditions, trees, the Section 106 officer and the enforcement officers to ensure that any breaches of conditions, legal agreements are identified at the earliest possible stage. So that's a more proactive way of dealing with some of the issues. And finally, we're putting provision in the budget for next year to utilise additional planning fee income to create an additional planning enforcement role. So that will, if you look at the current staffing is 2 people, that will actually make the staffing of the planning enforcement team 3 people, on top of the resource for obviously to monitoring the Section 106 agreements. So that's a considerable increase. I mean, I think that we recognise that there is always going to be a shortfall between what councillors and the public would like us to do in terms of planning enforcement and what we're able to do, and that we have fewer resources in this area than some of our neighbouring authorities. But again, as with everything else, it's a question of priorities and whether planning enforcement is a higher priority than street cleaning or all the other things that the council does, and that's a decision that the council has to make in the round. So that's the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader. Okay, members, do we have any questions or comments you'd like to make? Hands up. Okay, I saw David Green first.
On your first slide, I didn't see an item for investigating people that do work, building work, that might require planning permission. And I wondered whether you know how much of that happens.
So, yeah, so that would be a breach, because if someone hasn't got planning consent, then they're in breach of.
Yes, it would be. But in your stats, did you include that? I wonder to what extent that happens in Thanet.
Yeah.
So any complaint about breach of planning law, which includes people doing work that needs planning consent that doesn't have, and they don't have planning consent, would be included in those overall numbers. I think it's fair to say that the amount of detail that we're recording currently about the classification of the types of complaints is quite limited. Well, I can understand why you would want to see that sort of breakdown. Currently, it would involve the team going through all of those cases and identifying the specific circumstances of each one to give you that breakdown. But we do think that the additional resources in the team will enable us to give more sensitive reporting in the future about the category of complaint that's received. So is it work that's done without a planning consent? Is it something that's been built but in a way that's different from what was consented? So there's a whole raft of reasons why people might complain. Is it bigger than was consented? Those sorts of things. So it'll be able to give more sensitive information about those categories, but we also think we'll be able to give more nuanced information about the outcomes of those complaints. So at the moment, obviously, we've presented information about the number of notices that have been served, but you might be interested to know, how many complaints we investigated and we found that there wasn't a breach. How many complaints we investigated and we were able to resolve it with informal action or led to a new planning application that then was approved at planning committee, for example. And so going forward, we want to be able to report that level of information for you.
So Davis.
Thanks, Bob. Couple of questions. We're talking about in expanding the officer team, and I hear what everyone's saying about lack of resources. Could I just confirm how many hours a week the existing officers actually do put in on this and what they're employed for?
So we've got two officers that are planning enforcement officers, one senior and one officer. Their whole job is planning enforcement, so they're 37-hour-a-week full-time jobs. So what's that? 74 hours a week of planning enforcement officer time currently, right. And we're as well as the Section 106 officer role, we're putting forward budget proposals for an additional enforcement role in that team. So obviously that's 50% increase. It's probably worth mentioning that one of the issues that we do have to deal with is developers that have got Section 106 commitments in their planning consent that, then we don't know when they've hit a trigger point, or we have to chase for the contribution to be made or the specific requirement to be delivered. And that, with the number of consents that are, granted every year, that's quite a task. So the new officer is going to be able to enable us to keep on top of that as well.
No, thanks for that, Bob, because it's quite important, because the perception is, and very often, there's an additional discussion going on about communication, and that so it could be that officers don't appear to be at work just because we can't get answers from them, so but that'll be answered by the other inquiry. With regard to when an enforcement notice is served, does that then become the obligation of the monitoring officer and legal department to follow through on, or is there more officer time from enforcement involved once the notice is served?
There's more officer time from enforcement involved. So obviously we do have support from the legal service, and you know, if a notice is not complied with, we need to take a view about whether we then want to take a prosecution for that, for the fact that notice has not been complied with, and the legal service will support us through that process. But it does, obviously the enforcement officers have to prepare the evidence, and they have to present that, and you know, be witnesses to what's happened and so on. So there's quite a lot of work after the service of a notice if we're going to go to prosecution.
Absolutely. So, and again, I welcome recruitment and further, you know, further resources being put into enforcement, because for the record, it's a massive frustration, and there's certain parishes that are having huge problems trying to get any response on enforcement-related matters. So, in terms of feedback to them, it may not be the news we want to hear, but it is important, I think, that we have an understanding, because it seems to me that for especially with the amount of development going on, we are woefully under-resourced at the moment in that area, and it needs, you know, robust support, I would suggest. To follow on from what Councillor Green said as well, whilst the recommendations I thought were excellent about communication and better prioritisation, the fourth point very much focused on enforcing 106 agreements and following through. I personally, from my experience, believe that many of the planning breaches are actually on small individual projects where people just go ahead because there is no disincentive to them to put in a retrospective planning application, and perhaps we could mitigate that by a higher fee that penalises the individual, because I don't know.
No, you wouldn't be allowed to do that.
You can't,
because the whole principle of the system is that the planning application which comes in is treated in the same way as if it was a new planning application and it hadn't been built, and members are not allowed to take into account the facts.
No, I understand it, and that's why
I can't imagine that you'd be allowed to charge more for planning applications on developments that have already been built.
But disappointing to hear, but I understand. What I'd like to propose is that we ongoing look for some way to disincentivise retrospective applications, particularly when they're repeatedly done by the same landowners and developers who form a habit, knowing that once they've broken the back of the thing, it's very difficult to undo. So, but thank you, and I welcome the expansion of enforcement drastically. Thank you, Bob.
Councillor Wing.
I mean, when you've got two officers and you're roughly getting a complaint a day, each of those complaints necessitates an officer leaving the building to go and actually physically look at the complaint that comes in, or the potential breach. I can see why we've got such a low turnaround on enforcement, and I do think that we need to publicise more, and it's the little ones that seem to be lost. So I'm aware of two in my ward. One is a flint wall that's actually being rebuilt, so there's a success there, and then I'm aware of a 15mm gas pipe that's been put up the front of a grade 2 listed building, including taking out a section of the stone door, and for some reason it's been decided that no action will be taken on that one. So I think for me, I totally understand that when you've got two officers and a third one arrives, you're never going to have a great turnaround because it's physically impossible to do that. But I do think I would like to understand, given you've only got two and possibly three, there must be a rating, a grading, an assessing of which ones we are going to tackle, because clearly you can't do all of them. So I'd like to better understand, and if there isn't a system, maybe you just pick the ones you can get a quick turnarounds in, whether they're in conservation areas or listed or not. And then I assume there's there's a situation where a planning breach might be health and safety related, which is going to top a listed breach. So I'd like to better understand what screening process is used to maximise the limited resources we've got. And also I think it's really important for information to go back. So I've had to resend emails to the 2 stressed out enforcement officers to ask what's going on. We discovered the Flint wall was being rebuilt ourselves, but so I put more pressure on these 2 people because the residents are asking me for an update, whereas if that update it's being dealt with and enforcement letter's gone out, then I think that would, you know, if there's some way of a system being dealt with so that once the enforcement officer has actioned something, the email's sent automatically to the complainants, then it would probably help our limited resources to actually use their time better.
And I think part of the answer to that, Councillor, when is listed in the slides about which breaches are prioritised. I mean, obviously, if a complaint is made and verified and it fits into those categories, then I would hope that it's going to proceed to the next stage. And the next stage, you know, we're going to have to look at, first of all, has the breach occurred? And how easy it is to resolve, and whether it's in the public interest to pursue, because obviously there probably are quite a lot of planning breaches which are quite minimal. And I don't think we can discount the fact that some complaints are malicious as well, because there'll be people didn't want a development and then they'll complain about the development, you know. But I think if we were presented with evidence that we weren't addressing complaints that fit into the categories that we've said that we're prioritising, then I think that we would want to look at further.
Councillor White.
Thank you. Mr. Councillor Davis has had one question answered about the lack of response. Our parish clerk is always complaining that she puts a request in and doesn't even get an acknowledgement. I've also got an issue with a planning application that was permitted development for a single-storey extension. Nobody complained. I won't go into the details of why. Only one resident was informed, but that single-storey extension ended up as a massive, great loft conversion, which is now overlooking. It is sitting in one of the residents' kitchens, basically. I asked for the enforcement to come and have a look at it, and they said that they're not coming. And I think that doesn't help any councillors, because if a councillor raises a concern like that, they should come. I know they're busy, but this will impact grossly on a resident's living accommodation and quality of life. Thank you.
I think, Councillor Wright, one thing I would say about that is, if you're not satisfied with the response that you get from any part of the council, then you should go up the hierarchy and at least get an explanation for why you're not getting a response. So if something like that, if it's an egregious breach and if it fits into the complaints that we're prioritising, I'm quite happy if you bring that to me, but I'm sure Mr. Poulter is as well. And then we can get you a response, because I agree, you should get a response, but you might not like the response, but you should certainly get a response.
I agree, but it would be nice if an officer came out and explained it properly to the resident.
Yeah, well, thank you. I was going to say much the same, really. You know, if you have raised something with an officer and you haven't had a response, then, you know, it's right to escalate that either to Ashley, who's here this evening as the Head of Housing and Planning, or myself, or Councillor Everett as the relevant Cabinet member for planning. You know, you can raise those complaints in that way. You know, I think we would always want to try and respond to you as a ward member about what's going on. And I know the team do try whenever they can to respond to the complainant as well, to say what it is that we're doing following their complaint. You know, as a minimum, we should be giving some feedback about, you know, how we've assessed that complaint and what we're doing, and if we're not doing anything, why we're not doing anything. And I think, you know, that should be the minimum that you should expect in response to those sorts of inquiries.
Councillor Austin.
Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased to see the suggestions on these slides that we're going to put more information on the website, both in terms of the successful prosecutions to put off other people from trying the same tricks or whatever, but also I think the more information that we can put on the website about what is and isn't permitted in the conservation area or those kinds of things, because as ward members we get a lot of those kinds of, can I change my window, or those kinds of questions. If that information, we could refer people to, this is there on the website, this is there on the website, this is what happens if you don't do it, this is who to talk to, that would hopefully save a great deal of officer time and stop people making genuine mistakes that then take a great deal of unravelling. And I think it will be very interesting to see how those numbers broke down, because it feels to me like it would be a great success if a lot of those were things that planning officers had been able to deal with informally and sort out with the applicant, because most people aren't trying to pull a fast one on the council. They're trying to make their home better in some way, and maybe they haven't understood things. And we talked about this last week, and it's one of my particular hobby horses, is about us using simple, straightforward language rather than technical terms when we're talking to members of the public. And a lot of our information, unfortunately, has to have some technical terminology in it, but we need to make sure that we explain that. And if we've got that on the website, it feels to me like that there will be a less of a stress on those few officers who are trying to run around dealing with all those matters. Thank you.
Any further questions, members? Councillor Davis.
Just one related question, actually, and it's to do with perhaps easing the way forward. At the moment, the local plan's been on hold, originally for the recent election, and then ostensibly because of the DCO decision, which we now have. How long will it take for the local plan update to be resolved? Because that will also help in terms of future planning considerations, obviously.
I think that's a valiant effort to squeeze in something which is completely irrelevant to this topic, Councillor Davis. But the answer to the question is that there is one of the major obstacles to the local plan update is the government's review of national planning policy, and we can't really proceed. We don't even know exactly which methodology we're using to calculate housing numbers. So the reality is that we're not going to get very much further down the road until the government makes clear its policy. And, you know, it's not even clear. The government's saying next year, but the government may not be the government by the middle of next year. So it's a difficult situation. But I don't think it's got anything to do with planning enforcement.
No, not enforcement as such, but if we've got a clear local plan, then it'll help prevent breaches in the future, perhaps, with speculative building. That was the connection, but thank you.
Okay, so no more questions. It leaves me to thank Councillor Everett for your presentation. And members, please note the presentation. Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on to item number 5, which is the health and safety policy. I now call on Mr. Sunham to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair. This policy has been refreshed to take into consideration it requires the Chief Exec's endorsement and signature, and been refreshed to take into consideration the revised senior management structure, changes to corporate health and safety, committee structure and legal compliance. It's been through the CMT process, has been endorsed by CMT and has been recommended to this group to review, comment on and then recommend on to Cabinet. Thank you. If you've got any specific questions in relation to the policy, I've brought Stuart along who's written it so that he can feed back in relation to any particular queries. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, members, we're asked to make any comments or ask any questions. Councillor Austin.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just ask about monitoring where there are health and safety incidents, how that's done, who it's shared with, and how you record the actions that you take as a result, where there might need to be, for example, a change in practice or whatever, Stuart? Thank you.
Part of my role is compliance, and I have a compliance officer who's out and about, for instance, does compliance throughout the district to do with employees and our vehicles and our contractors. He reports back to me and I do an official report, which has only just started because we've only just got the resource. But the first report comes out for the last 3 months soon, which shows you what we've been monitoring. We monitor vehicles, contractors. My officer was in the port today monitoring the Mitre repairs. And it's quite a broad brush. You monitor vehicles, parking, right across to the actual core work we do in the council. And it's been rolled out. We haven't rolled out everywhere yet, but it's a work in progress. And there will be reports available on the compliance. We run it a bit like football, so people understand it. Yellow cards, red cards for breaches. Obviously, the severity of those, we have a list of what severe breaches are. For instance, if you're caught not wearing a seatbelt within one of the vehicles, that's a red card, for instance. A yellow card would be probably a breach in PPE. But they're all set out and been put through the union employee council. And it's a new process. We've only had it about 3 months actually live. And as I say, the reports are coming out and it is working. And now our staff and our contractors are getting used to it. If somebody just turning up and going, can I have a look at your risk assessment method statement, seems to have got about. And it is working very well.
I think it's also worth saying, Chair, that over and above that, we do have a centralised system where all of the issues with regards to health and safety, near misses, accidents are all logged, so that is a central system. All managers have access to that to input and also to check on where they are with them, and that gets fed back as well. We're looking at improving that process moving forward, which is why we've added in an extra step in the process at the moment, but we are looking at streamlining the way we do it moving forward so that there's more sort of timely information going through to CMT and such. So.
Councillor Wing.
Hi, thank you, Stuart. I mean, it's good to see that you cover a whole range of areas, but I don't see any dust monitoring on there. So we have a fair number of workers that work in close proximity to our aggregate plant and our cement batcher on the port that does generate dust. And I'm wondering whether we do any dust assessing on that area to look at the impact of our workers that are there.
I don't know if Chair, everybody knows that we have two health and safety branches within the council. We have the HSE side, which is environmental, and they do a lot of noise monitoring and dust monitoring, various other things in the community. And that's from the HSE side. I'm more the employee side, which you talked about, and I do noise, whole body vibration, and dust when required. But usually that's from complaints, and I've not had any complaints from the employees at the port, dust. If I have got a complaint or any issues raised in a risk assessment, then yes, I have the equipment to go and do that. But I only represent the employees, and that's what my main focus is on, and the public who are working on our sites. But from an outside point of view, that would be an environmental enforcement our colleagues in HSE which work in environment, and they have a lot of they've got those types of equipment, noise and dust monitoring when required. And we work closely together. I mean, sometimes I'll get a phone call saying this is one of yours, Stuart, or I phone the other way and say it's one of yours. So we do cooperate very closely and make sure that nobody's missing the gap if there is one. And there is sometimes there's a crossover in some points with contractors and various other properties.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Bright.
Thank you, and thank you for your report. I have 3 questions, if that's okay. I'll throw them all at you now, and you can pick them off however you like. The first one is really about sort of teams that are out and about. Do we have a system where people can confidentially report concerns that they have with operations? The second point I have is around home working and sort of mental health. So there's a lot in here about stress. Obviously, that's only half the story. Working patterns have changed. People might feel isolated, lonely sometimes. Do we have a system of kind of mental health allyship in place, or is that something we're looking at? And finally, in the Governance and Audit Committee, one of the issues that we have as a high risk is the lack of a health and safety policy, or not a robust health and safety policy. Does this being put in place mean that actually that comes off the list? I can see the nods, so that's good. Thank you.
I can answer. So from a reporting perspective, it was only probably within the last year we've made that compliance role within the organisation permanent. So prior to that, it was a fixed-term contract, trial it, see how it works. There's an opportunity for any member of staff to speak to that compliance officer, report confidentially, and it will be escalated from there as a matter of course. There have been instances where people have felt the need to report stuff, and it will then be investigated, and it either is or it isn't an issue and is addressed accordingly. But they do have the opportunity to say it. There's no ill will as a result of reporting. With regards to mental health, HR obviously, with regards to the policies that they have in place, are also picking up mental health for the wider organisation. So although it may not be directly referred to within this report, it is being picked up as part of the separate policies that are associated with staff matters. And risk, what was the last one?
The last one was relating to governance audit.
So with regards to the internal audit, which is what you're referring to, and the risks, this knocks one of the things off the list in terms of the fact that the policy is reviewed, updated and refreshed and adopted. Once that's done, it will drop off. There are other items within the audit, obviously, that we're working on, and that's a much bigger piece of work. But yes, this does tick off one of those items.
Great, thank you.
So Davis.
Thanks again for your feedback, Stuart and Matt. Just one question. You mentioned your colleagues in the HSE side of the council and so on. Who should we actually approach and speak to about this? Because there are substantial numbers of people that have got complaints about silica dust and everything, all that, particularly on the west side of the town. So who should we actually approach on this?
We have it's Morgan, no. So it's an environmental email address, and you drop them into, I think it's on the website, isn't it? Sorry, Penny's in charge of these, the environment.
It would be environmental.health@thanet.gov.uk, but it's not always going to be us. It could possibly be the Health and Safety Executive, because we split in half and have the same issues that Stuart has. So.
Thanks for that, because that pathway is quite important, because it's been a frustration for a long time for a lot of particularly residents.
If you look on the Health and Safety website, it actually tells you who's responsible for that local authority, what's local authorities are responsible, HSE's responsible, and then what I deal with. So it's all on the website. If you look at that, it clearly gives you... There is some grey areas, but they seem to work it out.
You're more welfare of the individual rather than the bigger picture, which they will look at. Yeah.
I even look after... I do induction for you guys on personal safety.
I remember it well.
So there's a bit of a crossover,
yep.
And it's purely the fact that we all work in the same goal, really, but we just have crossovers of who's responsible.
Absolutely no criticism. I mean, it's fully understandable, and sharing resources like that's vital, I think, with modern budgets and things. It's simply establishing that pathway, because as my colleagues as Ramsgate councillors will confirm, we do get a lot of people with issues on it.
As councillor, we will testify. If you email me and it's not me, I will pass it on to the person who it is, and I will give you an answer.
But super. Thank you very much. And again, if we can just get these lines of communication right, I think everyone's life will be a lot easier. So thank you.
Councillor Green.
Really pleased that you're getting to grips with recording and monitoring. But do you intend reporting occasionally to members on the results of that?
So with regards to the health and safety audit that's been through governance and audit, one of the recommendations is increased reporting, so inevitably it will find its way through to members as part of that process, yes.
Any more questions, members? No? I've got one question for you, Mr. Bundy. So more and more council staff are working from home these days. So how do you monitor health and safety in the workplace with regards to maybe electrical safety? I mean, I know in the report on 5.7 it says all fixed electrical systems and portable appliances utilised by employees will be inspected and tested at such levels. How do you monitor that when people are working at home? Maybe staff have got 2 screens and PCs and everything's plugged into extension leads and stuff like that. How do you monitor that health and safety wise?
Well, we have just done a piece of work which is out there at the moment. I think the deadline was was Friday, where we sent display screen risk assessments out to everybody who works at the council with an email address through the managers, and we've had a huge response. We've just got to go through it all. But on that display screen risk assessment's been updated now to include home working, flexible working, hybrid, and the questions are on there, because if you work from home, you're responsible for checking your own electrics and making sure you're house is safe to actually work at home. Also, if you rent, you're supposed to inform your landlord you actually work from home. So there's a lot of onus on the person who works from home to treat it like a workplace and make sure they've got the right environment, the right kind of furniture, the right place for GDPR. It just doesn't about health and safety, it's about GDPR, what you're working on. I personally work from home. My wife's put a curtain across the back of me, so she didn't have to look at me, but it is for a GDPR purposes, so that you can't see what I'm working on. And when we're on Zoom meetings, you've got to have headphones on, because you're talking about public stuff. So we have done that piece of work, which is just coming back to me, and I'll have some statistics on how that is later on this month. So that's how we monitor it. And managers are supposed to have one-to-ones with their employees on Zoom or in person. I think a lot of the managers prefer it now to bring them in and have that conversation. But I've also advised that they have that conversation on the Zoom. And we've all got cameras. All you got to do is turn around the camera and find out what their workspace is like. And when they do the risk assessments, they're supposed to do it with the employee, not give them the form and fill it in. They're supposed to do it with them and look at the screen. So if I'm doing my one of my people, I would turn the camera around and ask her to show her what situation she's working on, so I can make a determination if that's suitable or not. So that's what we've put in place, and we'll see some of the results of that coming through in due course.
Okay, thank you. Okay, members, is there any recommendations we'd like to make on the report before it goes to Cabinet? And that's a no, and I thank you to Mr. Sun and Mr. Bundy for their presentations. Okay, item number 6, it's a 3-year extension of the Dog Public Space Protection Order. So I'll call on Ms. Button to introduce the report.
Thank you very much, Chair. So for those of you who have been councillors before, you may well remember that we brought the Public Space Protection Order back 3 years ago to extend for 3 years, which is all we're allowed to do under the legislation. And we made some alterations at that point. This time round, we ask that you can read it, have a look at it, give me any feedback, and that we send it through to Cabinet with any updates for Cabinet for recommendation for approval. We've not made any changes to it, it's just a basic extension for 3 years to gather any further information that we may need to look at changing it in 3 years' time. We have had positive feedback, and that's throughout the report. Excuse me while I put my glasses on. So we've had positive feedback around the traffic light system, which we've used to describe exclusion zones to people. We use every season we use a dog code leaflet, which we distribute to people so they're aware of the signs, what they can and can't do. We have lots of people on board, including the beach inspectors or bay inspectors, cafes and restaurants, to make sure that everybody that's on the beach is aware of what happens with the dog control order in those particular areas, because they are our highest footfall, or pawful if you want to go down that road. So we will be aware that we do carry out engagement, education, and ultimately enforcement. Enforcement isn't the aim of a PSPO. The aim of a PSPO is to be able to engage with people and to educate them to have better behaviours, so to put their dogs on a lead. So we don't have, unlike Bob, we don't have a massive list of the number of fixed penalty notices we've served. It is a remedy that we can use, but we obviously try to detail with education first. So I'll take any comments if anyone's got any or any questions.
Members, Councillor Wing.
I'm a dog owner, and my dog does have to wear a muzzle. So, do we monitor incidents? Because there's quite a lot of incidents on Facebook, and there's been quite a few over the last, I would say, 6 months to a year, dog-on-dog attacks, particularly in our park areas, which I don't think are covered by areas. I mean, I personally believe that dogs in certain places should be on leads, because I think we've got, post-lockdown, we've got a serious increase in dogs that are not properly socialised. So have we looked at this, the number of incidents locally? Do we have policies for our parks? Have we taken into consideration the recent XL bully dogs, which, you know, is blaming the dog rather than the owner. And presently, I believe we have a serious poo issue on most of our streets. So is there any enforcement, and what can we do going forward together? Because, you know, you can't walk down a single street without potentially dodging around a pile of poo, I'm afraid to say.
No, I totally agree with that at times. We do struggle because people, particularly after we had the COVID lockdowns, have changed behaviours, and I think we've seen that in everything in society. So with regard to the parks and the dog-on-dog attacks, our dog warden has been involved in those with the police. Obviously, the police are the lead agency, but we do help them out in terms of seizures and transporting and that sort of thing. And we work very closely with them because they're based in the same office here. In terms of the XL bully dogs, we haven't taken them into this because this was written before that occurred. Obviously, if there is any change to legislation, that will be set, guidance will be sent out to us and we can adapt for that. Park areas are covered from this, and we do, the dog warden, obviously we only have one, and he does have a patrol route. We do focus on areas where we know we've got problems, so if you have an area where you're having a repeat issue, then please let myself know, and then we can focus the officer there. We also this year have had the addition of the beach enforcement team, which I believe we're looking to keep on over the winter, and they will be taking up some of that slack across the winter, which means we can spread across, because believe it or not, it's worse in the winter because it's dark and people don't think they're going to get seen. So yeah, we do have that extra resource.
Councillor Davis.
Good evening, and just a couple of quick questions actually, a couple of points in the report. Dog exclusion areas and areas that need to be kept on a lead, there's something that I'd just like clarified. The keeping of dogs on a lead 24 hours a day under Schedule 2 includes Pegwell Bay, Upper Chalkshore, but if we come down to Schedule 3 and the Ramsar and SSSI beach, which is all round total exclusion, Pegwell Bay, Mudflats, Saltmarsh and Upper Chalk. The Upper Chalkshore, is it dogs on a lead or total exclusion? Because they're the same areas mentioned in both.
Okay, I will have to ask the officers that. I don't know.
Sorry to chuck an awkward question at you.
No, it's not awkward at all. I will have to ask them and give you. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer.
But I think it could do with some clarity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why we're here.
There is one other point actually, and it refers to the about the relationship and responsibility for, and I can't find it now in the agenda, but perhaps if I write to you, there's one that it just needs, again, clarity, because it talks about people being responsible for a dog in their possession or a human. So it's just a typo, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I will look forward to that, and I'll make the changes for the report, because we want to get this right.
Thank you. Just a little point. Thank you.
Any more questions, members? No? Okay, so members are asked to make recommendations to Cabinet, so I presume there's none, and all that leaves me to thank Ms Button for the presentation. Okay, moving on to item 7, which is the review of the Overview and Scrutiny Work Panel Work Programme for 2023-24. Any questions or comments that members like to make? Councillor Davis.
Again, I'm going to get accused of bringing in new topics, but there's an important issue and it's rising and it affects the entire community. And this is the issue of the sea link down on Minster Marshes. It's a huge environmental matter that is going to be, and it's going to affect every single person on this island. There was supposedly a briefing by National Grid, which I don't know if anybody else managed to meet anybody from National Grid this afternoon. I logged on at 4 o'clock and was the only person in the room. They didn't even attend. So could I suggest, as a matter of urgency, because this is causing huge concern in the community, can I suggest that we get National Grid in and can have a frank discussion with them about their intentions and and how this affects this community? Sorry to ambush the work programme, but I think it needs to be dealt with as a matter of priority. Thank you.
Okay, I'll discuss it with Nick and Charles, see whether that can be a members' briefing or to scrutiny or fit it in somewhere in that. Can I ask?
Would be appreciated as opposed to just...
Yeah, sure. We'll look at where we can fit that in. I'm not, I have seen the consultation document, something not really I've taken much notice of, to be honest
There
with
is
you.
another briefing apparently due on Thursday, but if it's...
Okay, yeah, Mr. Councillor, just leave it with me. I want to ask Councillor Pritchard to come in at this point, because I know he's been leading a scrutiny review on our behalf.
Hello. Thank you, Councillor Fellows. So yes, we've had the tourism working group consisting of myself, Councillor Green, Councillor Austin, Councillor Packman and Councillor Cupp, although I think Councillor Cupp has been unable to attend so far. We've had 2 meetings so far. We're primarily looking at the sort of the downside of tourism and how we can sort of mitigate those issues. Particularly, there's sort of noise, antisocial behaviour, toilets, transport, parking, street cleaning. Obviously, the issues second homes and Airbnbs. So far, presentation Louise Askew, reports from Mike Humber and Bob Porter. And yeah, so we've been looking at those issues and also sort of going to be looking at sort of how other councils are dealing with those sort of issues.
Thanks. Just give us some idea on the time frame for the presentation of the document.
We're intending to have something sort of towards the end of the year, sort of a draft we can definitely be presenting by January.
Excellent. Good, because then we can look to get the next one set up, which is a fly tipping and abandoned vehicles. Councillor.
Thank you. Thanks, Councillor Britcher. I've got a slight concern about this one. Not in the work that it's doing, but just in the tone of it, because it was covered on the news recently, and it was all about the negative impact on tourism. It's Margate, it's Broadstairs, it's Ramsgate. We thrive on tourism. I would like to see some acknowledgement or work to acknowledge the positives. It would be good to be able to say, look, everyone's welcome. Just please behave yourselves, or whatever it's going to be, you know. So I'm just concerned that we go in this when we're reporting it to local media, when we're reporting to residents what we're doing, in that it is, look, we want you to come, we want you to visit, we want your money essentially, but please leave us as you find us.
I don't think the news report was anything to do with scrutiny. I think there was a couple of councillors that went off on their own.
Yeah, that's fine.
Councillor.
Can I come back on that, please? Because I was the person who suggested it, and the proposal was that we look specifically at how we counter the negative impacts of tourism. So it wasn't a generic tourism evaluation. It was looking at what do other councils do about the impact of Airbnbs on rents? Have any other councils found a better way than we have of dealing with second homes? Have any other councils imposed a tourist tax? What do they do about parking, etc., etc., and how does it link in with the other work that we're doing? So it does have a focus on the negative, but not in the sense of, oh dear, this is terrible, but in the sense of, okay, this aspect of tourism is causing us a bit of a problem. Do we know any other councils that are dealing with that better? Are there things we can learn? Are there proposals that we can put forward? Is there intelligence coming through from officer teams about how we might tackle X and Y more effectively than we are now? And most particularly, are there things we might need to build into the budget to be able to do that better next year? So that was the thinking behind it.
Sure, thanks.
I suppose I can see both sides of the story, but it would be nice if the document had a foreword that just briefly mentioned the benefits of tourism, how many visitors, the amount of money that, something brief, because you never know who in the media is going to pick up something and pick up on the negatives, and that's the last thing we want is for people to be turned away because on a bank holiday our Margate beaches are covered in rubbish, which they are, and it's something we do need to try and find a way to resolve. But I would imagine the vast majority of visitors to our towns and our villages are very satisfied with their visits because they do keep returning.
Councillor Bright.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying the issues don't exist. I fully agree with it, and I fully agree that we need to look at the impact of all the things you talked about. So it's genuinely exactly what I just said. Yeah.
I'm sure Councillor Bridgen is forward to the report and put some
Yeah.
positives in.
Thanks.
Okay. Councillor Curry.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wondered if there was any update on the requests for officer reports. There was 4 subjects: review of Section 106 management, broken waste bins review, an update on externally funded regeneration projects, and a review of governance and performance of on-street parking income.
Thanks for that. I was going to bring up to, I mean, obviously we've been told there's an extraordinary meeting in October, but our next standard meeting is on the 21st of November, and I was going to ask if anybody wanted to recommend a cabinet member we'd like to invite to discuss one of those topics. So discuss amongst yourselves who you would like to invite, and then and we can discuss it on one of those topics. Yeah.
I noticed Mike is here this evening. Maybe we could invite Mike back to talk about a couple of the subjects.
That's great, but he's not a cabinet member. So if he did the appropriate cabinet member, and I'm totally lost with all the...
Steve Alban.
Steve Alban,
well,
and if you tell me which subject it is that...
The subject that I did bring forward was the broken waste bin review.
Okay.
I think that we...
Not very sexy, but I'm straight on the broken waste bin, because you go to the Margate depot and there's hundreds of them, and all those waste bins are spare parts that you can buy, you know, and we should be, I've even offered to go down there and have a go myself, that we should be attempting to take those bins, pull them to bits and creating new bins for people who've had their
I've mended
tops.
my own. I'll teach anybody the secret.
You can actually buy the bits online, and it's much cheaper than going to and it's quicker than going to TDC and getting a new bin. You can actually get the red bins cheaper as well, the red bags cheaper. But they're all sat there at the Margate depot, just piled high, and it's a resource we could use to save our residents money and actually save ourselves money. So although it's not sexy, I want the bin one.
Okay, so we'll invite sexy Steve Alban to talk about something that's unsexy. Yeah, so that's it. A waste bin review on the 21st of November from Councillor Alban, if we all agree with that. Okay, fine. Something I was asked about today, Councillor's not here this evening to ask himself, was he asked about a presentation about Manston, which we decided was going to be after the decision. So we are at that time, so I think we'd invite someone from Manston to come along and discuss their arrangements and how they're going to get started. I think it's only fair. The leader. Yeah. The leader invites him, or the leader. Well, the leader's not from Manston, is he? No. Well, he's the one who's leading him. Hold on, can I just David Green?
TDC has statutory duty with Manston. It's a planning issue. There's absolutely no point in them coming here until they've got a business plan they can present to TDC. Absolutely no point at all. And in fact, because it's a planning issue, which will TDC has statutory duty over, I don't think we should be talking to them.
Councillor Zecchi, Councillor Wright and Councillor Davis, I believe you've all got something to say.
Chair, I think the DCO has resolved the planning issue, so it's not a planning issue at all. I think you'll find that should RSP like to come and talk to Scrutiny or anything, an invitation to Mr. Freudman would probably be welcomed. However, I think Councillor Green's got it very, very wrong there. Thank you.
Councillor Davis?
Firstly, I'd like to remind the committee we did agree to do this previously, but more to the point, if we are a statutory consultee to the process, then I would suggest that with the principles of scrutiny, as was set out to us in our training, it's vitally important that we apply some pre-scrutiny and have discussions about their plans for the future. Communication is surely the way ahead. Not communicating means they don't get a chance to explain their plans, we don't get a chance to get the up-to-date situation, and there's a lot of questions about Manston, and you know, it will be, according to the plan, carbon neutral. Let's have a chat, let's hear those plans laid out. And I'm glad I'm entertaining the gallery, but it's a matter of fact, and if the data is set out in front of us, then we can scrutinise it rather than just listen to propaganda from both sides.
Councillor White.
Chair, I believe that my understanding is that the government's decision on the project overrides the council.
Okay, Councillor Bright.
As I understand it, nothing's come to planning yet, has it? So,
Yes, it will.
That's what a DCO
well,
is.
I've got the mic at the moment, right? So I just think if once a plan is put together and it's ready to go, then we absolutely have to scrutinise it. But right now, getting someone in early, we're just going to listen to whatever story they're deciding to tell this month. Either way, I mean, I think it needs to go to a committee decision whether we invite River Oak in.
Councillor Wing.
Whether we like it or not, we are the statutory planning authority over that piece of land, and I sit on planning, and I would feel compromised. We have never, ever, ever, I've never sat in this body here and sat and listened to a developer talking about what they're going to do. And I think as an authority, we should be very wary of doing that. And as airport supporters, you should be very wary of doing that. You know, we need to be absolutely certain, whether we support the airport or not, that we follow the letter of the law. And I cannot remember a time when we have allowed a developer, because that's what our SP are, developers, they happen to be developing an airport, not a housing estate. We have never, ever, ever allowed developers to come and talk to a cabinet, a committee.
Councillor Green.
If you read the DCO decision document, there are 24 separate conditions that RSP have to meet, monitored by Thanet District Council, before they're allowed to put a spade in the ground. There are other things as well that they have to do. But Councillor Ring is right. We would be in severe danger of compromising the council if we go outside of the planning regime.
Okay, so the only reason I brought it up this evening was because when it was asked about previously, I think at the first meeting, I think it was yourself that said they shouldn't be allowed to make that presentation until after the DCO was made, which is why the person has come back to me today and said that DCO has been... So, you know, because you yourself said you thought that they shouldn't be allowed to make the presentation until the DCO has been agreed, so that's why I've been asked today to ask if they can come at the next scrutiny meeting. Councillor Davis.
I think we need to go back to what is our legal duty and our statutory duty as an overview and scrutiny panel, and basically anything that affects the people of this community or the community, it comes under our remit. There is absolutely no conflict in inviting an organisation to come in that has got the claimed £500 million, and I'll say claimed because, you know, none of us have seen that piece of paper, so all due respect to both sides. So let's hear the plans. The plans have evolved. This is not, and some of us have been monitoring this situation, and for the record, I support the reopening of Manston and aviation. I have not said that I unequivocally support any individual operator up there or any individual application. I may be predisposed to support aviation, but I'm certainly not predetermined, and would not be predetermined, which is why I think it's absolutely important and our duty as a scrutiny panel to invite them in and to allow them an opportunity to set out how they intend to proceed. Our statutory duty within the planning matters is to ensure that the authority given to them under the DCO is delivered legally and lawfully. Therefore, it falls under scrutiny.
Look, I'll just go to Councillor Bright first and then to you, Councillor.
Like I say, I agree that we need to scrutinise it once there is something on the table that's actually going to happen. But right now, as you say, we have to think about the statutory obligations. Councillor Wing is on this council. Councillor Bright is sitting here tonight on this council. I believe Councillor Rzeski, Councillor Moore, all sit on planning. How can you have a developer presenting plans for their development to people that are on planning? It's far too cosy for me, and I think it risks predetermination. I think this needs to go to a vote, because we're just going to talk around this. Do we want to invite RSP in for a presentation in the next couple of meetings? Yes or no? That's what I think.
Okay, so I'm being advised it's best not to invite them at the moment because there's some outstanding planning details.
We weren't inviting them to discuss planning matters.
I'm just being told what our legal advisor is telling me.
The object of overview and scrutiny is to scrutinise something which has been presented to us. Nothing has been presented to Thanet District Council. It's been presented to the government. So we cannot have somebody in and scrutinise something which has not been presented to us.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think it's important because there have been opportunities previously and in previous administrations for River Oak and RSP to present to this council, and they've been denied that opportunity. Consequently, and it's always been pushed back, or we wait until. We are doing ourselves a disservice by not scrutinising this.
Hold you there. Can I just bring in Samira?
I just want to clarify in terms of what Councillor Bright just said. He's absolutely right. There's certain members who are sitting on the planning committee. To bring anything back here will make a predetermination, so we can't have that. Not until the planning is actually all done and dusted. And then at that point, you've got everything out of the way, then you can. But at this point, it's not possible.
We can have a vote, but it doesn't seem like a vote. Yeah, no, I don't think a vote is necessary, but we will. Okay. Okay, so is there any suggestions for any other presentations, Councillor Austin?
It's Groundhog Day, so picking up on what Councillor Curry said before about monitoring on our regeneration projects, just that little timeline, just that little Gantt chart saying where we are with all the projects. So not asking an officer to come and talk about what's happening, and I know we've got an extraordinary meeting where we will have an officer coming to do that, but just that, can we establish that at every meeting we get something that says where we are with the different projects? Because there's a lot floating around in the local media about this and this and this being delayed, and we get asked about it as scrutiny. We need to be monitoring that closely. So just, Louise was talking at last week's meeting about the new arrangements with the government and about the red, amber, green system, just as Stuart was talking about, they do with health and safety. That will be brilliant, and if we can have that coming to us every meeting, then we can keep an eye on it. We really need to be doing that. That really is part of our responsibility.
Okay, as part of the pilot scheme that's just been agreed, I think there's some reporting mechanism that's going to be involved in that. I think Councillor Bright might have something to say, because I think he asked a question the other day at Cabinet.
It was, and I'd like to support that, and I'd second it if Councillor Austin wants to propose it, because I think last week we discussed it. It was discussed again in Cabinet, and I felt that there's probably a lot of agreement on that. So I actually think we need to push quite hard on this.
I think also the leader did actually say that overview and scrutiny is not the scrutiny of all the levelling up projects. It's Cabinet are the scrutiny of the levelling up projects. It's they are the decision makers, not scrutiny. But we are called overview and scrutiny.
I would say we are the scrutiny panel. We have a monitoring role. I believe it's vital that we monitor this on a regular basis, that it's just part of our standard agenda. It doesn't have to take a lot of officer time. It's part of the reporting they're doing anyway. It doesn't need an officer to come and tell us what's going on unless they specifically want to, or there's an item on the agenda. It's just something that we need to note at every meeting where we're at with this. And yes, obviously, at the end of the day, the decisions are Cabinet's, but we are the Scrutiny Panel. We are a council that has had huge problems with its monitoring, its governance, its transparency. We really need to be doing this and to be seen to be doing this.
Okay, Councillor Watson, I will definitely put that forward. Okay, so moving on to item 8 on the agenda, which is... I think I'll just do it as a chair's request, I think, and then, yeah, okay. Okay, moving on to item 8, the forward plan and exempt Cabinet decision list. I'm sure you've all had a chance to have a look. Does anybody wish to make a comment on that? Nope. Okay, so that concludes the business for tonight's meeting. I declare this meeting closed, and I thank you all for attending. Thank you.